I'm here at this moment to share with you some memories of my father. Obviously, I have known him for a lot of years. I am 67, and I remember many things from 4 or 5 on. My father, like anyone, had good and bad. So I'm not going to paint him as a saint or paint him as a demon. He is my father, and I will explain to you my recollections and how his life developed from my perspective. My earliest memories of him were walking around the block, walking in the yard, being pulled in a wagon, a red wagon, and he would be walking and smoking his pipe. That's one vivid memory. And one of the things that I greatly appreciate my father for is that he instilled and provided a love of music for us. He also provided a perspective of listening and interacting and thinking about what is happening in current events. And one of the things that I look back at and consider a tremendous point in my life was him giving me a spot in the backyard in which I could be creative. I was 4, 5, 6, and I had this 3x6 plot in my backyard where I could dig, I could wet it, make it mud, whatever I wanted to do. I learned how to plant seeds in that area of ground. I planted seeds that grew up to be beans. I grew plants that were radishes. I learned about agriculture in that little plot of ground. I could dig a hole. One day I wanted to dig a hole to China. My thinking, I think, as I recall, is I wanted to put the food that I didn't want to eat in the hole and send it that way. Because, they always told us about the hungry kids in China when I was a child. But I was able to be creative, and he didn't make fun of my thoughts or my actions. He accepted them. I turned it into a lake. A frog developed. But that plot of ground had social dimensions as well. It was right up against the backyard of Patty and John Eunuch, an old couple. They were the only old couple that I interacted with often. I learned how to talk to old people. I became comfortable being with old people. And I have been that way throughout my life, and it's been an asset in everything I have done, because age is not a limitation, but an opportunity. One of my vivid memories is going to places on the weekend with my father, Sears to change a tire, replace a battery, monkey wards, as my father would call Montgomery wards, in order to return some item that he bought that didn't meet his standards. My father also allowed me to explore interests. I became interested in tropical fish, and he encouraged that. He helped me get an aquarium. He allowed me to join the Colorado Aquarium Society. He took me to the meetings. So it was very beneficial. One day at Montgomery Ward's, we were in line after long waits. I finally reached into my pocket and took the $2 I had in my pocket and went to the nook next to the return line and bought a guppy. It was a big, fat guppy. It was intentionally purposefully bought because of its size. I knew it was going to deliver baby guppies, but I had no idea how quickly. As we were in line waiting to return the item at Montgomery Ward's, the babies started dropping to the bottom of the bag. By the time we got to the front of the line, my father held up the bag and said, "We've been in this line so long that this fish gave birth to 20 babies." It didn't really change anything, but it made a point, and some people snickered, and that became a part of my memory in life. He was able to teach us to do things he didn't know how to do himself. He would risk that. A lot of times we don't like to try to teach somebody something we don't know how to do, but my father didn't know how to ski, but he took us all skiing. We learned how to snowplow together. He taught us how to play golf, how to play tennis. And we went on trips and spent time as a family. Everything was pretty good until about the time of 1960. Our family went on one of those trips from Denver, Colorado to North Carolina. On the way, outside of Danville, Kentucky, our car was sideswiped by two drunks. They had stolen a truck and had been drinking moonshine in Kentucky or something, and they ran us off the road. Our car went down an embankment of 150 feet, rolled repeatedly. At that time, there were no jaws of life, so the only way out was using the crowbars to pry the doors open. That took a long, long time, and I remember the crowd in front of the car looking at the bloody mess inside the car and crying. That accident had an emotional effect on me even through my early adult years. I would pass an accident and that would traumatize me for a moment as I drove by. But my father was never the same after that accident. His back was broken, his arm had a compound fracture, his urethra tube was severed, and they had to get him to the hospital quickly before he was poisoned. Miraculously, we all survived, but the scars and the impact of that accident have been with us ever since. Looking back, I am sure that because of the emotional abuse of my father in early growing up, and in combination with that traumatic stress of the accident, it affected how he responded to things. I've worked with young people whose parents have been in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they describe the same symptoms. One minute, he's normal. The next minute, he goes off. That was my father. My father was also the one who had an impact in our religious life, along with my mother. They took us to church, but the impact really was felt after my father went to see a movie called For Pete's Sake. There he accepted Christ, and that began to change his life. My parents in 1989 attended a Billy Graham Evangelistic Association that I could not attend due to family situation with my daughter Caroline. She was in utero and causing extreme morning sickness all the way to the end. So we weren't able to go, and my parents went instead, and that had a tremendous impact on their life. My father grew in his faith. He wanted to do the right thing oftentimes, but whatever it was that happened to him, one minute he would be kind, the next minute he would be irrational and angry. And we tried to understand it. One time, many times we heard he was hungry. That's what set it off. But no, this was all the way through to the end. And his ability to control toward the end became less and less. But it has made an impact on my life. See, things that happen in our lives have an impact. God is in control. He is sovereign. His providence, his serendipitous effect works in our lives throughout our lives. I would not be the person I am today without that situation. And my sisters would not be the same either. Joseph, in the book of Genesis, was treated special by his father Jacob and caused all kinds of family strife. And the brothers hated him. And one day when they had him out in the middle of nowhere alone, they were going to kill him. They stripped him, threw him in a cistern, and were going to leave him to die until some traders came by that they decided it would be better just to sell him. We could make some money. We could tell Dad that he died, and we'd go home. That was an evil act. It was a terrible act. But in the plan of God, that terrible act had a good purpose. Years later, 37 years later, Jacob, the father, dies. He's known all about what's happened. The brothers think that the only reason Joseph didn't get even with him is because his father was alive. And they ask him through a message, would you forgive us? It was supposed to be a message that his father gave them on his deathbed. And Joseph's response was just tears. He had thought that his brothers had understood what had happened and that he had forgiven them. And at the end, he calls them in and he says this to them: "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to me harm, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." I would have to say the same thing. There were moments when my father's intent were not good, but God used it to bring about his purpose. And in my life, it's because of that growing up, and I was just explaining this to an adopted son of mine, that one minute I would try to trust my father, and then the next minute I would learn that I couldn't trust my father. And that went throughout my life. So what happened? The net result was I could never trust him. but that has made me the person I am. That pain, that difficulty is what allows me to help young people who've gone through similar situations. So now I look at how I grew up, what I went through, all the difficulties as being something that God intended to bring about good. It says in Romans 8:28, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. So I look back at my father's life. It was a mixed bag. There were good moments. The final chapter was when I came back in August on the 5th. I went into his room. It was late, but he was awake and wanted to see me. And he said with tears in his eyes, "Thank you for the Father's Day card you had sent me." Father's Day was in June. This was in August. So it had been in his mind for some time. And he said, "I have been a terrible father. Forgive me." And I said, "Dad, of course I'm going to forgive you." Those are some of the memories I have of my father. And I'm thankful for him, for all the things that he did to shape my life. God used it all for good.